Today we're going to go a little deeper into what exactly strong states and weak states look like. Huntington argued that strong states are highly institutionalized, but how do we know when a state is institutionalized? What does it actually mean in terms of organizations and policies? How would we measure it? The question is made more difficult by the fact that there are many, many terms used to describe the general concept of state strength or weakness. They all get at the idea of a good versus a bad state, but they refer to slightly different aspects of it. In this video, I'm going to review some of these core concepts with you, which will lead into a later discussion of measurement. So the first term is governance. Governance is typically referred to as good governance, and it tends to be a catch-all term that refers to the positive outcomes of government actions. The World Bank governance indicators are a good example of this. The World Bank, defining governance as the traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised, then breaks this idea down into 6 more specific dimensions, including rule of law and corruption. While the academic world sometimes defines governance more narrowly as the quality of public administration, an idea which is very similar to state capacity, international organizations and development agencies tend to go broad, including the quality of institutions as well as measures of democracy and the outcomes of government policy itself, equating good governance with sustainable development. In contrast to governance, rule of law has a generally accepted definition. This is the principle that all people and institutions are equally subject to the law, that government is not arbitrary or in service of an individual, but rather is conducted through formal rules. In both academic and policy circles, however, rule of law tends to refer to narrower concepts: judicial independence and due process. Rule of law usually means something related to the legal system rather than the executive bureaucracy, and assistance tends to focus on helping parliaments write legislation, providing training for judges and law enforcement officials, and promoting legal aid. One concept that has gained popularity recently is the idea of rule of law contrasted with rule by law. The idea is that the ability to change the law to the benefit of those in power, for example, extending the number of years a president can serve in office, which would be rule by law, is not the same as lawful, legitimate authority, or rule of law. State capacity is an academic term, although you will also find a wide variety of development programs focused on capacity building. My preferred way to think of state capacity is how well a government is able to form and implement policy. The term has its origins in the concept of infrastructural power, but scholars break it down into a variety of dimensions. Hillel Sofer, discussing infrastructural power specifically, breaks the concept into 3 dimensions: the capabilities of a central state, its ability to collect taxes or raise an army, for example; the relationship between state and society, which is vague but gets at the idea of whether a state is able to forge a national identity through the education system, for example; and subnational variation across those 2 elements. In other words, does the state exert similar levels of control throughout its borders, or do rebel movements, for example, exert control in some regions? Other scholars, such as Levitsky and Murillo, add the element of time, focusing on whether institutions are stable and durable. In other words, does a country change its election laws every year, or have they kept the same system for a long time? Has a country changed leaders through a series of coups, or has it kept the same political system for years? Finally, scholars who focus on the capabilities of the state itself, what is most commonly referred to as state capacity in the academic literature, tend to break it down into 3 dimensions: extractive capacity, which is a state's ability to obtain revenue from its citizens through tax collection or from natural resources; coercive capacity, which is a state's ability to maintain order within its borders; and administrative capacity, which is the degree to which a state's bureaucracy has the professionalism, autonomy, and expertise to implement policy. In other words, just how Weberian that bureaucracy is. In the development community, capacity building tends to have an even narrower focus, emphasizing job skills training for bureaucrats. On the other hand, in politics, corruption is one aspect of state weakness, although it's not really the opposite of either governance, rule of law, or capacity. Political corruption covers aspects of both a legal system and a bureaucracy. As Rose Ackerman and Polifka note, corruption covers bribery, extortion, embezzlement, nepotism, many different types of activities within a civil service. Corrupt activities allow abuse of power, but tend to degrade governance and rule of law indirectly. When civil servants undertake actions in exchange for money, rather than because they're the best policy, the quality of governance declines. Or when civil servants are hired based on family connections rather than qualifications, they tend to perform poorly, and so on. Anti-corruption assistance programs tend to focus on legislation banning conflicts of interest, bribery, nepotism, and other corrupt activities, and on creating mechanisms to make corruption more transparent to the public. So establishing reporting requirements for what boards of companies you serve on and things along those lines. I want to take a moment here to talk about a term that comes up a lot when speaking about corruption, and that's the principal-agent problem. Political scientists and economists will talk about principal-agent problems in a wide variety of contexts. The core idea is that one party to an agreement, the principal, delegates authority to another, the agent, to act on behalf of the principal. The problem is that the agent doesn't always do what the principal wants. This is used to describe everything from employment contracts to elections, where the voters are the principal and the representative is the agent. In the context of corruption, the principal is usually depicted with a leader as the principal and a bureaucrat as the agent, and bureaucratic corruption is what leads to a lack of implementation of a leader's policies. But it could also refer to a leader not fulfilling public expectations. Lastly, I just wanted to note that what we've talked about in terms of corruption doesn't usually cover election-related matters. The influence of money in elections tends to be discussed either in terms of interest group influence, the extent to which campaign donations influence policy, for example, or clientelism. Clientelism covers a range of activities, including direct and indirect vote buying, as well as offering civil service jobs in exchange for support. The core idea of clientelism is patronage. A politician or party will build support by offering personal benefits, while corruption, on the other hand, is a more general phenomenon. We will cover clientelism and the separate issue of electoral fraud later in the semester. Despite all the terms I've discussed in this video, we're still talking about concepts, not measures. In class, we'll focus more on identifying measures of state power, or institutionalization, and linking them with these concepts.